Right. Good morning to the audience. Welcome to the 2023 Thought Leadership panel. There's actually a series that started at this very Free State of Art Free State Art Festival in 2018, where we started to grapple with the idea of the university as a social institution, but also as a public institution, contributing to discourse, talk about the issues of the day, but also try to reflect on that more intellectually, but also from a perspective where the public can understand it. So that started in 2018. We probably had about 3 or 4 a year in 2019, and towards the end of 2019, 2020, COVID hit us, and then we went on virtual. We went online. It then became a webinar series, and the webinar series was actually well attended. We normally would have about 250, 200, 250, 300 attendees of the webinar series, and with the advantage of a virtual online series is that you could also attract audiences outside of South Africa. So we had participants from the audience perspective from the rest of the continent, also in other parts of the globe. And a lot of this, the discussions, we have fantastic panelists, and I will introduce also this panel just in a minute or two. The media have picked some of those suggestions, discussions up from those panel discussions, also within higher education. And as a university, it's also important to always ask the question, so as a social institution or public institution, our role is also to develop the next generation of citizens that can operate in the different parts of the economy. What is the lessons that they should extract out of such a panel discussion? And we're also going to ask that question today. The Thought Leadership Series talked about topical issues. So we had the state of South Africa, for instance, in the past that we talked about. We talked about the power crisis, electricity crisis. We talked about governance. We also talked about the criminal justice system. We also brought it a little bit closer to the universities, where we looked at how universities tackle student success, employability, and all of those things became part and parcel of the series of thought leadership discussions, which is in fact enormously rich. And our communication department do have that as part of our archives, but I think at some point we probably will have to sort of condense them and bring them together as a series of thought leadership panel discussions that happened since 2019. So today it's a very interesting theme that we will try to unravel and try to see whether we can come up with a better understanding, but also ultimately the Thought Leadership Series is supposed to provide practical solutions or interventions for both the public but also for our students to say, well, what do we need to do? So the theme of today's discussion is about a culture of acceptance. Is this South Africa's greatest threat? Now, I can probably talk myself for about an hour or more on the challenges that we have in South Africa. We talk about. I talked about electricity crisis. We talked about. We can talk about the government itself, the ruling, the government, and the delivery, service delivery, and other ways in which government responds to their citizens. We can talk about crime. as a particular issue. But the whole question of I think the question that one often have to ask ourselves was all of these challenges that we have in the country, and the fact that we are South African citizens, that we have elected government or officials or individuals into government, and there's an expectation from those that we elected to serve us, if we use the right terminology. And if that doesn't happen, do we challenge them? Do we challenge them in terms of accountability and in terms of what they're supposed to deliver? And how often do we, and how do we challenge them? Or do we say, we've reached a point where it doesn't really matter what we say anymore, nothing is going to happen, so we're going to do it ourselves. And then, on that side, doing ourselves, it obviously could demonstrate a level of resilience of the citizens of South Africa, but it also can bring to the fore innovation, entrepreneurial thinking, different thinking of the citizens of South Africa or the civic society. Now, on the one hand, is that a good thing or a bad thing? The way that I looked at it, if we not challenge the accountability concept continuously, and I don't necessarily know what is the right way, and the panel is going to tell us maybe what is the right way, and we just accept that this is what we're going to get, and this is the best that we're going to get, and we have to make our own plan, you then develop a thinking of expecting or just accepting that we're not going to get better. And that acceptance provides a level of a bar of what you can expect. And I think that bar, by just accepting, is going lower and lower and lower. And therefore, if that's happening, remember, we educating our future generation of leaders. If that is what they see, then, why should we always reach for the stars? Why should we reach for the highest bar? And I think that culture of acceptance in a society, for me, is a major challenge. And once you slide, I think it's going to be hard to stop. And behind this theme of a culture of acceptance is this South African greatest threat. Is not only talking about the non-delivery, the non-performance, or actually the poor performance. It is about what is the value system that we develop in our society, and what is the value system of our future citizens that are exposed to that. That's the threat that is captured in this theme. But that is how I looked at it. But let me come back to our real experts, and I'm so proud and that most of the panelists this morning are actually related to the University of the Free State, besides Piet.
Yeah, I have the honor of having completed my PhD here, so I'm very local.
Okay, local. But that's fantastic. That's fantastic.
You don't have to introduce me. I'm local.
But that's fantastic, because I want to start on my far right, which is for me is really an honor to introduce Professor Bonang Mohale. Everybody should know Professor Mohale. Or Bonang, as he wants to be called. He's a business leader. He's somebody that writes. He's a writer in itself. He's somebody that addresses public platforms. He challenges the status quo continuously. But above all, besides a business leader, you can also throw that in. But I think the important thing is our Chancellor. Chancellor of the University of the Free State, Bonang. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you, sir.
And then Lindy Koorts. Lindy is, in fact, involved with the University of the Free State. She's a research fellow with the Center of Gender and African Studies here at the University of the Free State. Also a prolific writer, a public commentator, and I often hear her on different platforms. And Lindy, it's fantastic to have you here. Lindy Koorts.
Thank you very much.
And then on my immediate left is also a good friend of mine, Dr. Sipho Pitiane. He's also an astute businessman. I learned to know him when I worked with AngloGold Ashanti. He was also chairperson there. He was also, when I was there, he was chair of the Safety and Sustainable Development Committee. And then I don't know whether he followed me or I followed him. When I was Deputy Vice-Chancellor at University of Cape Town, he was also the chair of council. And you have seen him also challenging the status quo specifically. He's still doing it, but specifically and visibly during those 10 years, those wasted 10 years, he was one of those people that in fact, was with Benang, that continuously has spoken up and out. The relationship that Sipho have with our institution is an honorary degree recipient from our university. Sipho, it's great to have you here. And then Professor Piet Kroukamp. And Piet, I'm glad that I didn't know about that relationship with our university, but it's great to have you. I'm also a great follower in terms of what you say on public platforms. I think we are together in a week's time or so.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, we're going to be debating, but now I'm moderating the debate this morning. Piet is an academic at the Northwest University in the Department of Political Studies and International Relations, also an astute public commentator, and Piet, it's great to have you here. Thank you
very much.
So what we're going to do is I've asked the panel that I'm going to give them 10 to 12 minutes just to give their perspectives and how they view this specific theme, and then after, so I'm not going to interrupt them, so I'm going to go through all four, and then I'm going to sort of challenge them with a few questions. And I would like also you, as the audience, if there are particular questions that you want to ask, please keep that in your mind, or if you want to write it down. There, I'm going to give an opportunity for the audience also to ask a question, or two, or three, or four. There's a roving mics that will be available, so it's good for the audience also to participate. We do have live streaming as well, so I would like to say good morning to our viewers on the live stream. There is live stream through the University of the Free State website, as well as through the University of the Free State YouTube channel, and I know that there are also going to be people that will use those platforms. So good morning to you as well. Piet, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to move to Benang, and then I'm going to go to Sipho, and then I'm going to come to Lindy. Piet, you'll...
I usually thank you very much, Francis, for inviting me in the first place. For me, it's a great privilege to come back here. I have been here in 1981. I failed each and every subject. Literally, the best I did was politics, 25%. And I left the university, and when I walked across the campus, I've been here a few times before, but when I walked across the campus, I came upon a spot where my varsity girlfriend at the time, she was studying medicine. And I was so embarrassed to tell her my marks that I left without telling I'm leaving. And she's still happily married. I'm divorced for 20 years. Anyways, so what I usually say to my students at the beginning of every year is I couldn't care less, especially my postgraduate students, I couldn't care less what you think. I don't care what you know. Google knows more than you. And what you think is none of my business. If you tell me during this year what you think, I'll give you nil for it, nothing. I will only assess how you think about things. That's what I'm curious about. What is your reference points, your comparative thinking, your ability to analyze, and your ability to understand, and ultimately your ability to explain. And I think of all the things that we could argue that's going wrong in South Africa, I think it's when political elites neglect their responsibility to think and to understand. And you will hear, and I suspect some of my colleagues on this panel is going to make exactly the same mistake today. They will use narratives which are the obvious explanations, and rarely, if ever, it really benefit our understanding of anything. And I sometimes make the same mistake. It doesn't mean that I always get it right, but I think it's of critical importance that we should understand that the way we think about things is critical to understanding. So when people say, for instance, that acceptance, do we accept things? Do South Africans just accept things? Has it become normal to us because we know nothing else? It's absolute nonsense. And I have the evidence for it. I often speak to farmers and business chambers, and if another farmer or another big businessman tell me, you know, black people, they will always vote for the ANC. I say, which country do you live? When last have you checked out the election data? The last election, 12% of the eligible vote in South Africa, people who are allowed to vote, between 18 and 108, only 12% voted for the ANC. 88% voted either for other political parties or stayed away. And if you are naive enough to think that South Africans that stay away from the ballot box have nothing to say, it's for your account, because they have a lot to say. In fact, the last election in 2021, only 47% people turned out to vote of the registered vote. Only 47%. The reason why the ANC dipped below 50% is because people stayed away. And by staying away, they're saying something. They're saying we've lost confidence in this particular system, but more so in this political party. It's the biggest motion of no confidence that I've seen in the history of South Africa. 12% for a completely legitimate political party in a free and democratic society. Says only 12% could identify with that narrative. So don't tell me people are passive. People have nothing to say, and people have accepted things. It's simply not true. I often, if you can refer to a plethora of civil society groups. We have a very, very robust media. We have non-governmental organizations that goes the extra mile at great expense. We have a massive involvement of people. It's just, we have, it is the complexity of the participation and involvement of our society is so deeply embedded. I'm surprised that people only respond when they see there's violence and think that's a form of pushback that they see now. So the last few days, we have this burning of trucks in South Africa. And it's curious to listen how people try to explain that. And the very first thing they do is say, oh, in 2021, at Mooirivier Plaza, there was a burning of trucks. And that was associated with the instability that followed on the arrest of President Jacob Zuma. And because there was such a close, in terms of time, coincidence between the arrest of the president, former president, and this violence and destruction, they think they have something to do with each other. The arrest of President Jacob Zuma and the instability in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng has got very little to do with each other, except for the fact that it might have provided the spark. But that spark could have been provided by a stampede at the soccer game as well. I wrote a paper on that, and I call it the spontaneous internal combustion of a fractured sociology. To this day, there were no kingpins arrested. And okay, I know the police and the hawks, they never arrest anybody, but still, there is no evidence that this was the initiative of anybody with a political agenda. That a lot of people and a lot of interest benefited from it, that's something else. But that particular event, you have to understand it correctly. It was a fractured sociology. And we know that we are 70% urbanized in South Africa. We know that 62% of children in South Africa come from broken homes. They don't know who their father is. We know that 70% of people in South Africa live in relative or absolute poverty. We know that very few people have access to good medical care. We know that 70% of schools are dysfunctional. We understand the sociology, the complexity of it in terms of its fracturedness. We know that the economic system in South Africa, to a large extent, continues to support the breakup of the black middle class family. Black people still have to drive 30 kilometers further than anybody else to get to work in the day. This system comes from the apartheid system, where black people were located in the homelands, and then we needed black cheap labor, so we extract the men to come here. Then you've broken up the family. Now we liberated the system, and the women can come and work here, but they don't come and work with their husbands, they work somewhere else. Now we've extracted the women also from... We have destroyed the black middle class family. And if you look at the nature of middle class families that are fractured in South Africa, you can find them in Harlem, you can find them anywhere in Europe, you can find them in Asia. It's always the same pattern. Fractured middle class families, early pregnancies, early school leavers, drug abuse and crime. If you want to know why the violence in South Africa is so much more, I would call it prolific, than in Botswana and Zimbabwe and other places, partly to do with our urbanization, but partly to do with the destruction of the black family. That's at the root of it. I'm not saying it's the only explanation, but it's an important explanation. So if you want to understand crime in South Africa, violence in South Africa, the nature of violence, that's one of the points where you have to start. That's one of the ways that I think you have to think about it.
Peter, yes. You've got sort of a minute.
How much time do I have?
A minute.
A minute only left. Okay, good. Okay, so let me just give you one more. What I actually wanted to say, I'm never going to get to it. I actually want to say, so this truck burning that we have now, it is, and I'm just going to tell you what I think it is, instead of explaining myself because I don't have the time. It is black entrepreneurs who has developed within black economic empowerment, who operate mostly in the informal economy or in the black economic empowerment sphere, and now seeks to enter the value chains of the formal economy, with, in this case, the logistics economy, and they compete with each other through the use of violence. When Becky Kelly, for the first time in his life, he said something that I think was absolutely spot on when he said this week, this burning of trucks is business related. It is, and especially it spilled over from the mining industry in Mpumalanga. It is economic empowerment entrepreneurs that use crime and violence as a means to establish themselves in the value chain of South Africa's logistics system. I'll explain that later if I can, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. Don't for a moment believe that nonsense that has got something to do with July 2021.
Thank you, Peter. And there's a couple of things that we will come back to you. I'll make sure that we give you an opportunity to respond to those. Bonang, over to you.
I think I need to start with where Peter has ended off, because sometimes things just don't happen on their own. In agreeing with him, of course we need to analyze. But for me, what we are beginning to accept, and we shouldn't, is the fact that if wealth is an inevitable outcome of both hard work and enterprise, then every woman in Africa should be a dollar billionaire. So why are they not? And what are we busy with, if not seized with this issue? And what we are busy with is what Pete is saying. We are busy burning trucks. But we could have burned trucks in April when we were on holiday. We didn't. For me, it is interesting that on the second anniversary of the 2 weeks in July, we now see clearly coordinated attacks on these trucks. Let's go back to the facts. So we wake up on Monday morning, 6 trucks have burned on the N3, which is a major tributary connecting Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. That evening, 5 more trucks at the Waterval-Boven Plaza have been burned. What we knew at that time is that there were 2 cars that were involved. The modus operandi was the same. About 8 people jump out. They get these truck drivers. They ask every single solitary one of them, you're only allowed to take your ID, nothing else, and then they burn the truck. By the end of that day, 13 trucks had gone up in smoke. Monday morning, 2 more trucks in Mpangeni are burned. Today, we look at the number. When I came here early in the morning, we were on 21 trucks. There's no way that this is spontaneous. The N3, the N2, the N4 that connects us with Eswatini and Maputo, the 2 provinces that are involved, which is Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, are more than half the provincial contribution to the national GDP at 51%. Gauteng is 35% of that national contribution with 14.3 million people. GDP 1.5 trillion South African rands, followed by KwaZulu-Natal with 11.1 million people and 692 billion South African rands. When you compare and contrast it with the Western Cape is the first biggest, but at 13.4% of provincial contribution with only 6.5 million people. And that number, it's about 543 billion. But Western Cape is growing, KwaZulu-Natal is dying. Why is this important? The timing is important because when you look at the data on the 19th of July, 2021, which we refer to loosely as the 2 weeks in July of a failed insurrection and rampant looting, there were 2 components. Minister Bigitele at that time called them the dirty dozen because there were 12 people that were identified. He said they are known where they are and they are going to be arrested soon. Pete is absolutely correct. Up until now, the people that we have arrested is a radio DJ and not anybody else, even though we know who the perpetrators are. Yesterday, he has another press conference. He tells us about the dirty dozen again. Look at how we are accepting this number easily. The same way that we have accepted a report in 2003 that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that said the people that did not get full amnesty because they didn't disclose must be charged. 20 years later, nobody has been charged. So I think there's a culture of acceptance of saying we are going to do A and we do nothing. And there are no consequences. The 2 weeks in July is important. Because again, if you just look at the figures on the 19th, remember what we are trying to solve for is the fact that all of us collectively, individually and severally, have not succeeded in eradicating the legacy of apartheid. That 51% of the 65 million South Africans are women. And yet their representation in positions of leadership, especially C-suite, at 24%. African women, less than 4%. What is occupying our every hour in trying to solve this problem. It's burning trucks. To what good effect? We know there's about 10 mafias that have been identified, gold mafia, and you can name them. But again, no consequences. How does it manifest as I end? It's not the fact that we are still in the midst of the self-perpetuating vicious cycle of abject poverty, where 30 million of the 65 million South Africans live below $2 per day. It's not even the fact that we are now holding the world record for all the wrong reasons. The most unequal society in the world took over from Brazil in 2010, Gini coefficient of 0.63. Highest SME failure rate in the world. When our BRICS counterpart, 60% of the new jobs created are from SMEs. Ours is south of 15 percentage points. Country with the highest GBVF rate in the world, not by a factor of 2, but 5 times the global average. Second only to Russia in terms of suicide rate. And what are we busy with every hour? Preoccupied with burning trucks. So in July 2021, of course there were 2 components. Part of it was highly organized, orchestrated, WhatsApp messages. Even the way they would come was almost uniform. There was another half that was spontaneous. The tinderbox that Pete is talking about. But look at the economic consequences. They are not helping our women and black people. They are plunging them more into poverty. And as I end, at that moment, and my marker is just the 19th of July, 2021, we had killed more than 350 people. We had burned 200 malls, decimated 5,000 businesses. We had put 40,000 jobs at risk. We had burned 8 warehouses and 11 factories. We had looted 1,400 ATMs and stole 160 million rand. 3 pharmaceutical companies. In Durban, in Prospecton, in a container, 1.5 million rounds of ammunition that later found its way in cashing transit heists. And this culture of acceptance is, we know it's the 2nd anniversary. We want to look for answers anywhere else except on the people who have a vested interest in ensuring that they destabilize the status quo, the system in this country. And we, as ordinary citizens, are looking up at the people that have demonstrated beyond any shadow of doubt that they are spineless, they are indecisive, they are not about to lift a finger. If South Africa is going to work, it will work because business has decided it will make South Africa work. If South Africa is going to work and this culture of impunity, of acceptance is going to stop, it's because you and I have decided that this is as much our country as it is that of political parties, of labor, but also of civil society. It's when you and I say not in our name.
Thank you very much, Benang. And I will definitely come back as we zoom a little bit closer in the discussion in terms of what we need to do. I do know that there's a lot happening in the business sector. Probably try to unpack that a bit from both you and Sipho. Pete talked about there's a lot of activities happening in the civil society. We'll talk about that. And then also what the general public, what institutions of higher learning could also be doing. But thank you very much, Benang. Sipho, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if I can add much more to what has been said already. But I think that the most urgent thing that faces this country today is a failing state and the acceleration of that failure of the state. And the question that we as citizens have to ask is what it is that we need to do to stem that acceleration. I think you need to sit and think for a moment why it is that when you open your TV, you open your TV box, the Minister of Police stands there and speculate as to why there are so many trucks burning. And the language and the communication from the minister is similar to what you have at your dinner parties when the minister has an infrastructure of intelligence and the wherewithal to actually provide the answer and not speculate like you sitting at your dining table. So it's ESCOM. Actually, it's not ESCOM. It's the fact that we have a shortage of electricity supply, water supply, the fantastic failure of local government, etc., etc., etc. I start there because my reference point all the time when I think about this nation is the Constitution. Because the Constitution, you see, is a fantastic tool in the hands of each and every citizen. There are two things that when we adopted the Constitution we did. Two very important pieces of legislation were passed. The first was the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. It's a tool to enable citizens to hold government to account. What decision did you take? Why did you take it? You have to explain yourself. There is no arbitrary rule. The next is PAIA. It's about transparency, promotion of access to information. How did you arrive at that decision? So, the Constitution is a very empowering tool in the hands of the citizens. It's my first reference point, actually. The next point I want to make about the Constitution is that it enjoins us to drive a values-based system, society. A values-based society as distinct from a majoritarianist society. Oh, people don't like homosexuality. I suspect, actually, that if you took a vote today, the majority of people would say to you that we want death penalty because we're sick and tired of crime. But a values-based system that the Constitution is holds us from that. It doesn't matter, you can have a referendum today and the majority can say we'll have 80% say we vote for a death penalty. But because the Constitution holds us to a right to life, we wouldn't be able to implement it. The importance of that is that it is a tool that is about saying to each and every one of us as South Africans, what is the vision of a country that we want to build? The value of the Constitution is that we must build an inclusive society. And it doesn't matter what our station is. For as long as there's a poor person somewhere, we are exclusive. For as long as there's somebody somewhere who doesn't feel that they belong, they don't have access to health, they don't have access to education, they don't have access to a range of things, it is not good enough to say that at least I get it. So South Africans have got to discover the value of of the inheritance that we have in the Constitution. Unlike in the past, I could ask for President Zuma to go whilst he was in office, and I wasn't arrested. There were all kinds of things that happened. I can tell you about it at another time. It's the freedoms that the Constitution enables citizens to not tolerate an environment where the state fails and fails the people, and fails the people in terms of realizing what the Constitution promises 30 years on. So I hear, Pete, what you're saying, but I think that we must temper our appreciation for the role that civil society plays with appreciating the disempowering and how disempowered and desperate people who are at the tough end of a failing state are, and feel that they can't actually take the system on. They don't have the resources to take the system to courts. They can't take desperate small business people, hawkers and all of that, who have a little bit to take to sell the next day that rots in the fridge because of load shedding and power failure, don't have the resources to actually hold the state to account. The people who were killed in KwaNobuhle have a right, actually, to say to Pegicele, thank you very much, we have enough tears here, don't come and cry as well here. You must arrest the people that actually did the killing. Don't have the wherewithal to actually hold Pegicele and the president to account for the failures of the criminal justice system to ensure that there is safety and there is safety of life. So in the pecking order, civil society plays a magnificent role in various ways. But it intervenes in very select areas which may not actually matter where the rubber hits the road, always. I think that all of us have a responsibility to play our part. But I do worry, and I'll conclude at this point, Chair. As a businessman, I urge business to play its role in ensuring that we have an inclusive economy and a society that is successful. But with the weakening and the deteriorating and the continuing failure of the state, I fear about an imbalance between the power of business and the power of the state. In the nature of things, the mission of business can never be the mission of the state. The state has a responsibility to the people. Business has a very specific responsibility to those who invest their buck in business. So there can be no substitute to actually ensuring that we deal with the issue of the failing state. Just think of Somalia. Just think of many other failed states elsewhere in the country, in the world, and look at the consequences. Is that where we want to be? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sipho. And certainly, when we sort of go down to a more granular level of interventions and what we should be doing, I'll come back to some of the issues that you raised, specifically the imbalance between the power of the state and the power of business. And if each of those entities have got a specific mandate, if we start to creep away from those sort of mandates, then one need to understand what do we need to do. But I'll come back to that. Lindy, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm so glad you spoke of the Constitution. And we've been speaking about the values in our society and of our next generation. And in the universities in the past 8 years, we've been very much involved in the greater disillusionment with the transition and the Constitution. You have factions even agitating for its dismantling as a Western construct. It's a whole other debate. But what that tells me as a historian is the extent to which we have forgotten. We've forgotten the 90s, early 2000s. All that remains are these nostalgic ideas of rainbowism with which we are thoroughly disillusioned. And we have forgotten that there was a social contract. There was a social pact. There were values ensconced in that. And then the question is, to what extent have we raised our next generation with those values? I was a child during those times, so I do remember it, but I was not one of the decision makers, but it's lingering. It keeps lingering with me. And when we had the roads must fall, fees must fall, decolonization movements, I thought to myself, well, these were kids who do not have those lingering memories. To what extent was it transmitted? And then fingers were pointed at the Constitution. And for that, I would say, no, it's not the fault of our Constitution. It's not the fault of our legislation and policy frameworks, because especially during that era, we have extremely good legislation on the books. We have very good policies on the books. When we speak of reconciliation, fingers are pointed at the TRC for its failings. It's not the fault of the TRC that we failed. Why did we fail? We failed to implement. And a lot of that has got to do with a government that has a centralizing urge. It wanted to centralize this implementation. One should also say, yes, there's responsibility in the wider society with regards to values. But when you have a government that wants to do it all for us and centralizes that and then does not do it, what do we do then? And for that, I would say the ANC suffers from what I would call broad church disease. And this is the strangest place in history to go and look for your example. But of all things, I studied Afrikaner nationalism for most of my career. And nationalism seems to function the same way the world over. And of all people, D.F. Malan, the man who instituted apartheid in this country, spoke of catch-all parties that try to be everything to everyone. And when they try to include so many factions, they don't get anything done. So his Nationalist Party, of course, which was populist and focused on a very particular group with a very narrow set of values, was extremely effective. That's actually a terrifying thought. We should keep that in mind. But then what happens with a party with all these factions, but also with contradictory forces within the same institution? That is when it's almost like an engine that keeps grinding against itself and it doesn't move. We've got a lot of fixation on ANC factions in the news. It's been since the Zuma era, I suppose, and it's the RET faction and the Ramaphosa faction, and now everyone is becoming worried about Mashatile and the Alex Mafia. But there's a much longer history of this. We do need our long-term view. I would recommend anyone to read Stephen Ellis's book, External Mission, on the ANC in exile, and then you'll see how far these factions go back. If you speak of the ANC, very often you need to say, which faction are you speaking of? It's not a single institution. And if you want to see how this manifests in practice, I saw that in reading Andre de Ruyter's book. I was astonished in reading how this man had to report to 5 different government departments at any given time. And then you've got departments with policy frameworks that contradict one another. If you follow this department's policies, you are in contravention probably of another department's policies. So let's say we've got a magic wand and we'll cure corruption tomorrow. How are we going to go about a contradictory policy framework? There's a huge structural problem at hand here. So what is the answer? In a sense, yes, Pete, I agree. We've got a huge vote of no confidence in the ANC through the stay-away vote, but it's keeping us where we are, unfortunately. We do need a transition, because we've hoped that the ANC would self-correct, and all I see is that the contradictory forces just intensify. Does the answer lie with our opposition parties? I would say they suffer from the same broad church disease, unfortunately, because you're trying to find as many votes as possible and you accommodate as many as possible, which is very, very laudable, but again, contradictory forces mean that you're not getting anywhere. Unfortunately, if there's one party that does not suffer from broad church disease, I would say that's the EFF. They really know what they stand for. But there again, I will bring you back to the DF Milan example and say that's not the road you want to take. What we desperately need is, yes, a party with a coherent policy framework that is absolutely inclusive, that is not based on populism and identity politics, but actual good policy that we can get behind, and to have it implemented. Now, if we wove a magic wand and said, the ANC is out of government tomorrow, we have a new party with a wonderful coherent policy framework, will that solve our problems? No, and this is where the culture of acceptance becomes our problem. Of all the places, I would say, and I think in a university context, yes, thank goodness there are younger faces here, go watch Netflix, of all things. On Netflix is the series called Servant of the People. That was the series of the current Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky. And when he was elected, the world laughed, not because he is a comedian, but because they thought it was ridiculous. Until I went to watch it, and I thought, no, do not laugh. This is searing political commentary. And the political commentary was all about government corruption. I mean, you watch that, I mean, there's an entire episode dedicated to how do you manage to fix a broken road full of potholes. It was astonishing to see how many there are. And yes, then the entire feeding chain comes into it. There's a whole episode on how companies are registered in relatives' names, and that is the way in which you hide your money. Does sound rather familiar. What I found astonishing in Ukraine's example is life then imitates art. This comedian who calls out corruption has a show in which he shows how difficult it is to uproot it. Even when you have the good guy in power, these networks are entrenched. And then what happened? The good guy comes into power and life goes beyond art, because if this was fiction, everyone would have laughed them out the door. But guess what? They've got their neighboring country invading them. And it's the invasion of one of the most corrupt countries in the world by one of the other most corrupt countries in the world, which is another layer of the narrative. And that should actually serve as a warning, because closer to home we've got more examples. One, I would say, contemporary and one historical. I more or less cornered one of my Zimbabwean colleagues yesterday, and I almost interrogated him about how's it going in Zim. And his explanation to me was the informal sector is thriving. If you are able to work it in the informal sector and you've got your government connections and patronage networks, you are doing well. Houses are being built, grand cars are being driven around, and it's definitely not in the interests of this informal connected sector to have a change in government and to have proper government regulation. They are thriving. Why would they on earth want a functioning state? And historically, go back to the late 19th century here in South Africa, we've got the big narrative of the invasion of Paul Kruger's Transvaal by Rhodes's company, the Jameson raid of 1895, and soon after we had the South African War. And the way in which this narrative is always run is, oh, it's Britain who wanted the gold reserves and wanted control over South Africa. What historians have found in recent years is, no, Britain could get, the networks of gold distribution were working fine. They were able to buy gold from South Africa. They didn't need to control us. There was much greater fear of the power of the landlords on the Witwatersrand and what their complaints about the Kruger government. Yes, they complained it was corrupt and they complained it was inefficient, but that didn't mean they wanted the British colonial government to come and intervene. They just wanted a government that they could control. And a lot of them functioned extremely well by bribing the Kruger state. Again, corruption, is extremely efficient if you are the one benefiting from it. But what was the outcome in that regard? War. We don't want to go there. I mean, these are extreme examples. I was thinking earlier when we spoke of elites who are, basically feeding off the people, because that's what we have. If people are doing it for themselves, we're fixing our potholes by ourselves, so great, that money can be pocketed. We're getting our refuse to the dumps by ourselves, great, more money to be pocketed. Solar panels, water tanks, etc., doing more and more for itself, but tax collection doesn't stop. So you have an elite feeding off the people, while the people do it for themselves. But further back in history, I mean, it sounds extreme, but what happened during the French Revolution? You had an elite feeding off the people. What happened during the Russian Revolution? You had an elite feeding off the people. In the long run, this is where you go. In the long run also, even if you manage to make it through your democratic processes, if you allow these networks to embed themselves, good luck in rooting them out. So yes, of course, I do want to drive my car without writing off a tire, and I have written off a tire here in Bloemfontein thanks to potholes. Thank you very much. So I'd be very grateful for whoever wants to fill in that pothole, because tires are expensive. But on the other hand, doing it for yourself cannot go without accountability, because otherwise you're going to just be doing more and more and more for yourself. And the historical examples are not pretty.
Thank you very much, Lindy. It's good to have a historian on the panel, because it does bring you back to what has happened in the past. And the way that you've sketched it, sort of in my mind, the question that I have is, would we ever be able to disrupt this system? Because if it comes through, and there's various examples that you cite, and there's probably more of what has happened in history, and we haven't learned from that. And once it's embedded and it's coordinated, it becomes very difficult. So I want to come back to the theme was really about acceptance. And Pete, you said that's completely nonsense. And I'm going to give you some time just to explain it, because it seems to me that there is the way that the other three panelists have articulated it is that there is a degree, depends on how you look at it. But yeah, tell me a little bit more.
I think Sipho mentioned something which I think is fundamentally important. That is the disempowerment of society. Many communities in South Africa are completely disempowered. But to ascribe that to a sense of acceptance, it's not the same thing to be thoroughly disempowered. It's certainly, those people do not accept it. Let me just, your reference to the informal economy, which I think is very, very important. The South African informal economy is not a chaotic system. Poor people and marginalized people and people in informal settlements don't operate in a completely chaotic system. There's a value chain and there's a supply chain. There's a sense of responsibility and there's a sense of risk-taking. They have no support from the state. They do it for themselves. And the only way to make a rand is to take a risk with another rand. So I think there's this myth that the informal economy is some chaotic system where a small group of people just turn around the buck or two and make a little profit, and that's the life of the informal economy. It's a very complicated system. In fact, it's fundamentally important if you want to build an effective and efficient economy that you have to have the mindset that prevails in the informal economy. Let me give you another example where I think we've gone wrong as far as policy is concerned. I think black economic empowerment is fundamentally important. It's not possible to sustain the fact that 65% of the people in boardrooms are white males. It's just not sustainable. I think black South Africans should have a larger share in the economy. It's fundamentally important for stability, for trust in the system, for reliability of the system to perform. All those things are fundamentally important. But I think the way that we think, and Maletse Mbeki says something similar, the way that we think about it has created something that's a monster that now is really undermining much of the formal economy in South Africa. What we've done as the ANC is they created thousands of trust fund babies. People who've never ever spent a single rand by taking a particular risk to make another rand. The problem with getting access to the formal economy without taking risk is that you occupy a supply chain and a value chain which eventually you have to defend through the use of violence. You have to stabilize your presence there by competing with other people who have never taken anything but a political risk, but never took an economic risk. It's the way that we think about these things. It's fundamentally important. I've spoken to many black farmers, I've spoken to many people in the informal economy. For them to get any funding from government, any funding from the banks, from them to get access to capital, is almost impossible. There are thousands of black entrepreneurs in South Africa who are desperate to take the risks that is required to build a proper and efficient supply and value chain in South Africa. They don't get access to this because the state is absent. In South Africa, our biggest problem is not only the inefficient state, it's not only the corrupt state, it's not only the state that's not fulfilling its functions, it is the completely absent state. For the vast majority of South Africans have no relationship with the state. State providing no services, no protection to them. I'm talking about market protection, financial protection. The state provides nothing of that. It doesn't give them the opportunity to invest a rand, taking a risk to make another rand. They never, that institutional memory of risk-taking from the basis of the informal economy is never advanced and extrapolated to the formal economy because of the absent state. So I think the state neglect in South Africa it's devastating, but we have to understand exactly how it impacts society. And our explanation of the informal economy is one area where we should dispel the myth. It is not a chaotic system. It's not a lot of poor people just preying on each other. It is a well-functioning value chain where people understand and know the value of risk-taking.
Okay, thank you, Pete. I want to come back to Benang, picking up on the absent, failed state. State doesn't deliver, and business that comes in. I know that there are various initiatives that business are involved with in trying to provide that sort of service intervention that the state actually should provide. I think the most recent one is the Neil Froneman and Jannie Durant one from Remkro and Sibanya. But Benang, your perspective on that?
And I think it's good that we started with the Constitution, because that's where it brings it back to you and I. And we say it's the best constitution in the world because it starts with those words, we the people, not the politicians. Recognizing our past injustice. And in the middle, it both implores and mandates you and I to fix these past injustices. And it's premised on 3 pillars. The first, of course, is this notion of a constitutional democracy. The second is social justice. The third is fundamental human rights. Yes, freedom of speech, freedom of association, but most importantly, freedom from hunger. This is the one that is less sexy. So as business, we look at this and we say, you know, we don't want to be another failed state because the state is absent, it is failing. Some would say it is already a failed state. We then say, you know, we need to continue to do well by doing good. Because when business does well, society generally does well. Doing good is good for everybody. But we are trying to also dispel this myth that when business creates jobs, it is philanthropic. Actually, it is creating markets of the future, because there's a problem when your own workers can't afford the goods and the services that you provide. So we met the president on the 19th of January, 2 years ago, and we said, these are the 5 things that we're going to invest in, with or without you, better with your support. We've just met the president now on Thursday, the 25th of March. We realized that, you know, as business, we are very good at focusing on one thing. So instead of 5 things, let's reduce them just to 3. So the first, we said, of course, we have to invest in infrastructure. Here we're talking about ports, about rail, and about roads, because Transnet is really failing. And if you thought Eskom was a bigger problem, I think Transnet is going to be a bigger Eskom. And if you thought the lack of supply of a stable, reliable, and predictable energy supply that Sipho was talking about is a big problem, wait until there is no water. So now we talk about load shedding, water shedding, now energy shedding in general, because even liquid fuels are not even guaranteed. The second we said we're going to invest in is in our networks, just to make sure that at least we are able to communicate. And the third, we picked law and order, safety and security. Why did we do that? As I end, it's because look at how this failing state manifests for all of us. First, we said, of course, inequality is widening, racism is at an all-time high, but it's actually black graduates who are roaming the streets hopelessly. Public education has collapsed. Public health care continues to fail the poor and the vulnerable. And crime has become an epidemic.
Thank you, Bernard. I want to come back to the remark that you made, Sipho. Obviously, we all, in fact, the panel is in agreement that we've got a failed or absent state. And I think that's clearly visible. The question is, if you have other constituencies that comes in to fill that gap, your concern was that there's an imbalance in power between even what the failed or absent states still have and the other constituencies. Pete talked about how disempowered society is. How would one come in if you are business? And I'll come back, Lindy, later to civil society to ask a similar question. What then should we be doing?
Well, I think that we're not a failed state yet, but a failing state, elements of which are systemic failures, elements of which are probably irreversible failures in certain parts of the state. And that poses very serious problems. I do want to come back to the point about business. You see, the former General Secretary of the Communist Party coined the phrase tenderpreneur. I have no doubt in my mind when he was talking about black entrepreneurs that were dependent on tender system and exploiting the state system and enriching themselves, which of course must be an abominable conduct. But I will say this, that often a reflection on this is quite ahistorical. Let's go back a few decades ago when the Boere was migrating into the urban areas. The phenomenon of black empowerment and integration of the Boere into the public service, the tender systems that built some of the empires of today, is no different, actually, to the manifestation of how the state uses its procurement infrastructure to facilitate an inclusive participation of previously excluded black people from the system, or women. It doesn't take away the fact that there's corruption there. One of the books that I read with great interest was The Rise of the Ruperts. Amongst my great friends in business are the founders of Altron, who gave me a break in life, by the way, as partners in business. But that business was built on the back of procurement and deals with government. And you can go through a whole range of others. So the phenomenon of supplying the state as business doesn't start with black business. It was there before with the integration of the Afrikaners in the economy. It was there with the toenadering between, in the pre-apartheid period of segregation. That's why you had Rhodes, who was a miner, but was also a very important part of the state system in colonial years. So we mustn't have this notion that there is a sudden emergence of a bunch of darkies that are raiding the state with no sense of ethics. Now, the big issue for us is that we need business that appreciates its responsibility in building an inclusive society. Because business is indispensable in the project of repositioning the society, including repositioning the state to be able to deliver. Because we must all understand that the state is indispensable to delivering the promise of the Constitution. For as long as the state fails, crime and violence will be preeminent. The potential that we have as a country to grow and develop and to be a world leader will never be realized. The poor will continue to be marginalized. We spent time when business, were discussing earlier on with Bonang about how we engaged in moving business from the idea that they are a partner with government for their own sake. You will have heard in recent period the emergence of business for South Africa. And the idea was to enable business to think about what is it that we do collectively to protect and to enable this country to be successful, not just for the benefit of our own individual businesses, but to ensure that the country succeeds sustainably. And part of that is to be sensitive about the fact that we must not campaign for pockets of society to succeed and work, because that's where we'll benefit, but to ensure that society as a whole is effective, the state is effective. The deterioration in the state system is very real. It's in transport system, not just Transnet, but Sandral, the outsourcing of and the concessioning of some of the roads is because Sandral cannot cope with maintenance and sometimes the need to build the infrastructure. The other is for us to actually get out of ideological dogma. We now have a state that actually doesn't have the resources to deliver in some of the areas. That creates opportunities to enable access to capital and therefore partnering with private sector to build that infrastructure and deliver services to the people. So it's absolutely critical in my view. But the most important thing for me is a partnership that is founded, that has very strong ethical foundations, and it's not about stealing from the poor. No business person should sleep well at night. When you build schools at 3 times the price than is otherwise required, because you will have stolen 2 schools from the poor. Every time you overprice a tender to a hospital, to wherever, you must count yourself a thief that got away with it. So it's absolutely important to have a business that is rooted in very strong ethical foundations to ensure that we build a society that is sustainable.
Thanks very much, Sipho. After Lindy's response to my question, I'm going to come to the audience. So if there's if you have some questions, just keep them ready, and there will be a roving mind. Lindy, my question is more, how should civil society respond to these sort of challenges? If we do have a culture of acceptance, however you define that, and from which angle you approach it, and there are various things already happening in civil society, what should civil society and ordinary citizens like you and I be doing to get that message across?
I think it's a very difficult question, actually. And I'll root it both in the contemporary and the historical again. In the contemporary sense, I really do agree with Sipho. It's such a problem that it's pockets. It's not coordinated. It's a bit here, it's a bit there. My experience of many of these civil society organizations is because politics are so polarized, they try and function outside the sphere of politics. A lot of them have very good, noble ideals. Many of them are using this as an opportunity for social cohesion and for value transmission. There are the examples of let's us all fix the potholes together, and wonderful in how that brings people together, but it does not bring us structural change. In the end, civil society cannot determine our foreign policy. They cannot build our infrastructure. They cannot, use our taxes according to our policy frameworks. For that, you still need government. And the historical example I do want to look towards is actually the UDF. And that was an umbrella of civil societies throughout the 1980s. But what did they do? They did not just agitate for change within the civil society sphere. It was a push towards a political transition as well. So if civil society can do that, of knowing, yes, it is in the civil sphere, but it needs to push for structural reform, because structural reform cannot come from civil society. Value transmission can. For that, they have a crucial role. But structural reform needs to come from the political sphere. And if it's a push towards that, and then holding our government accountable, for that I will give civil society credit. They do hold accountable as much as they can. And for that I will give our press a lot of credit for keeping up the accountability. Unfortunately, I think we are suffering from accountability and outrage fatigue. So maintaining that is extremely, extremely difficult. But we do have a good historical example. But that calls for cohesion, that calls for focus, that calls for, I would say, a push in the right direction.
Yes, Sipho.
To that, one of the things that happened is that the Zuma years were so crass and in your face, and shocked us out of our boots, if you like, about what we contended with. But today, we are victims of a spin, the lingua that gives us a sense of hope that the right thing would be done. But 5 years post-Zuma, you could very well say 15 or 14 lost years. We said 9 lost years, it's 14 lost years. I raise that to suggest that perhaps civil society has been very accommodating of the Ramaphosa era than we were of the Zuma era. And in part, it's about concern that if he goes, who takes over? Wouldn't we get somebody worse? And therefore the level of tolerance, including the media, and therefore the level of tolerance of incompetent governance, blatant incompetent governance, that has landed us in this disastrous place today, is about a fear of, if we lose him, who do we get? I have to say, it's an important question, but it is not enough to justify inaction on the part of civil society and others who were at it in the Zuma years to challenge government's incompetence, because the deterioration in the system is a consequence of heightened levels of tolerance, perhaps in civil society and the media, about this government. So it is urgent from my perspective that government has to appreciate that citizens cannot tolerate and are quite vocal about their level of intolerance about the deteriorations that we're seeing.
I know that you would like to come in. Yeah, you can come in. I think you're talking about Cyril probably will indicate why he couldn't do what he needed to do.
Second,
the president will probably suggest or have reasons why he probably weren't that active.
I think we've moved a little bit through the motivation for people's inactivity, but I want to remind you of something that I find particularly curious, and it's not limited to this panel and even my role in it. Have you heard the word economic growth today? Nothing. Not a bloody word about that. And if you mention it, you could be stigmatized even. But unless we have economic growth, we will not manage to do something about 42% unemployment in terms of the extended definition. We will not have the surplus capital to extract in the form of taxes to deliver services in South Africa. We will not have economic stability at all in South Africa. We will not be competitive. We will not be able to look after our citizens. But the elite narrative in South Africa has a habit of avoiding the difficult issues, the difficult questions. And I think that's part of the problem. Remember when I said earlier, it's not what we think, it's not what we know, it's how we think about things. And it's prevailing in South Africa. It's rare for political elites, academic elites, economic elites to raise the real big question is, how do we provide opportunities for a spirited society, which we are? You can only do it if it's important to you that the economy should reach the form of fruition where it can provide to everybody a decent living. That doesn't mean the state is absent and then we neglect the duties of the state and we ignore the massive responsibilities of the state. I'm just saying, without economic growth, we will be where we are now in the next 20 and 15 years, and there'll be nothing left for anybody to compete for.
Thank you. Let me see whether there are any questions from the audience. There are two there at the. I'll take probably 4 or so. There is a roving mic. If you can just identify yourself, and if you want, and just keep the question brief, because the panel was supposed to provide a little bit of background, so I think they did. So if you've got a brief question, specific question, and if you want someone to respond to it, if you can also indicate where you'd like to respond to it. Where's the first? I'm just thinking. Yeah, okay. Just identify yourself as well.
Thank you. My name is Lucy Sehloho from Student Affairs, Arts and Culture. And this is a very interesting discussion that we're having. And I have a question more, it's a question statement, my own observation, so it's not based on data. I'm at the university, so I must always be sure. My question is it possible that our culture of acceptance is based on our racial tension? Is this making it easier? The fact that we have cultural tolerance amongst one another, we tolerate, we pretend, we hate covered, and we blame a lot, and no one wants to take accountability. And I will ride on what Pete has started with and say, if we are talking about acceptance and we are looking at the elite that are able to fix their own potholes in their societies, When was the last time you took a turn to the location to see the number of people who are drunk from early morning hours because they have accepted that that's their life? And if we are not going to talk about getting them out of poverty, are we really serious about this discussion that we are having? Thank you.
I'm going to take that question to you, but you don't have to respond now. I'm just going to say this, Lucy's question. Is there another over there?
No, thank you very much, Program Director. My name is Wilson Magwandana. I wanted to check on this issue of acceptance. I understand that, and the speaker that just sat down now mentioned that we seem to be blaming a lot. And it has become acceptable for everyone to say, if you want to become relevant, then blame government. But I'm glad that Bonang at some point mentioned that the Constitution implores on us, and us, not the state only or the government only, but us as civil society, as individuals. At what point do we take responsibility for our actions? At what point do we say, these politicians account to us? At what point do we say, our actions are actually destroying our country? Let me give you a typical example. I drive a lot through the N4 pass. I want to give you a small example. Emalahleni, Nelspruit, and so forth. Between 2019 and 2020, there were a lot of accidents. Just as you pass Emalahleni, just before Matthew Poza off ramp, a lot of people were being killed by cars there. Then the municipality, and I'm not defending government. Then the municipality decides to build a wall so that people don't cross the N4 to the other side and then get bumped by the cars. You know what they do? They break holes in the wall, in the wall. Then they try to walk through them. The cars kills them. The municipality is doing nothing. So there's people doing them. The people who are banning cars, we theorize and philosophize about all of them who are banning trucks and all of them. We know them. They live with us in the communities. What do we do? They are our brothers. What do we do? Nothing. Because their actions benefits us at some point. And I'm coming now to business, and I'm very glad that there's prominent business people there. At what point does business take responsibilities for its actions as well? And I accept that business plays a huge role in terms of giving bursaries, in terms of investing in infrastructure development, and all of that. But look at some government policies and legislations. It's got the fingerprints of business, it's got the fingerprints of academics. They help government to, at some point I used to work here in the Free State. The Free State Growth and Development strategy. The consultants who were helping in developing that were from this institution. But in the evening, you see them on TV analyzing and blaming government. So the point I'm trying to make is, all of us, political analysts, you name them. During the day, they blame government, they do this and do this. In the evening, they take 12 million to write books. So who must we believe? When are we taking responsibilities? We will get to government. Let's take responsibilities in fixing our actions. Let's take responsibility in doing what we are supposed to do. Perhaps when we do that, our country will move. Lastly,
Wilson, I'm going to stop you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop you there. Can I ask him just to your question? I want to give a lot of people some time to ask questions, and I said the panels have done the elaborations already. So if you can just ask your question. Sipho, are you going to be, or do you want to respond to that one? This one from Wilson. Or Pete, do you want to? Yeah, okay. So Pete will do that one. Where's the next one? Over here.
Goeiemorgen. Oorlog, chaos begin. I feel like it's an internal war. My question is it a culture of acceptance or a matter of being conditioned and being silenced, muted by the system? I'll just leave it like that. I would love Prof Pete to respond to that one and Dr. Sipo to be in particular.
Sipo, I'm going to give that one to you. All right. Can we take, is there another question? There's one there at the back.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings to the panelists at large. My name is Hlumelo Kaba. My question is posed at Prof Bonang. You mentioned something along the lines of businesses at a better position now in terms of revitalizing the country's economy and all of that. But now I think my concern, or many other people's concern, may be the fact that what effect does businesses' investment in the country's economic growth have in as far as eroding the state's sovereignty is concerned? For instance, currently now, we cannot lie about the fact that our parastatals and SOEs are at a very dysfunctional state. And the only way in which we think to revitalize them is by privatizing them. But now the concern now comes in is that what effect does that have in terms of eroding the state's sovereignty over its economy, as well as ensuring that the state still plays a role in providing for its citizens? And then also, another one of my other questions is posed at Dr. Lindy, which is about accountability. So currently in our country, we live in a country where whistleblowers are at a very big risk of losing their lives once they speak out about certain things. The courts are not doing anything about certain politicians, looting and also misusing state resources. So I think it's now a matter of the culture of acceptance, and as far as that is concerned, is because of the fact that people fear for their lives, because we know that day in and day out, whistleblowers get shot at, or whistleblowers get hunted down for whatever reason they speak out of. So then, what are we to do as citizens of the country? I think most people just say that they accept the things the way they are because they fear for their lives. And people, for instance, there was a current report that came out that the Zondo Commission should actually be reinstated again so as to see which state capture inquiries they can actually look at post the report that was submitted last year. So my question to you is then, what are we to do in the current status quo, and as far as ensuring that we do still hold those in power accountable, as well as the private sector for that matter, because we cannot take away the fact that it's not only government, like my brother over there mentioned, that it's not only government that is responsible for all these malfeasance within the state, but business does also have a hand in it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to take one final question over there.
Hello. Greetings, everyone. My name is Tabam Mashoma. So, I don't know, my question is directed to the three panels, including you as the chair of the session, because I feel like you also play a role in this, whatever I want to speak about right now. But we've been speaking about wasted 9 years, it's now 15 years, but I strongly believe that it's wasted 30 years, more than 9 and 15. It's from when the current government took over, because the policies of the current governing party are good. And it's not about the implementation, but it's also how do you bring socialist policies in a capitalist system? Those two things will never work together. I mean, they try to give us free education, yet at the same time, the people who are running the same education want to maximize the profit that they're making, they're going to make. Now, the question is it really a capitalist system that is a problem in South Africa, or is it really the government and the people? I mean, we're blaming the wrong thing here. The system is the one that is brutal. The system is the one that doesn't want any change. If we are going to change anything, then perhaps it's time for us to look at the survival of the fittest system, the profit maximization system. That is the one that is destroying us. I mean, if businesses are going to get tenders from the government, I'm studying actuarial sciences, and I think the most important concept that we do there is managing risk at the same time maximizing profit. So what do you expect businesses to do when they get tenders? They will forever try to maximize the profit from whatever tender they got, because it's the current system that we're in. I'm most definitely going to go in the industry, and I'll be expected to implement exactly what I was taught. Maximize the profit, which is the mean, the average. Make the most out of it, yet at the same time reduce the risk. Now, if businesses have got a role in changing this thing, then I would like to pose this question to you, Sipho. Should we then abolish the tender system and try to build a state capacity that is going to now run all those programs efficiently? Or should we continue with the tender system that is going to give people 10 million and then they are going to use 1 million to provide the service and take the other 9 million? But otherwise, I feel like we're being stopped from changing things by the same people that come to, like my brother said, or at night, during the day they speak this, at night they speak this. Why am I saying this? Is that the unemployment is so high, yet at the same time, even financial exclusions in the universities, it's just increasing every day. The chairperson of the session is there, knows very well how many people are struggling right now in this institution. And every time when we try to say we want to take an action, we're being stopped. I happen to be part of the 2015-2016 fees must fall at another institution. And I don't think that fees must fall was effective. I don't think it's because we were strong, but it's because the funders of the country actually funded that fees must fall, because they were against the person who was in charge, the president of the country by that time. Not that they really believed in giving us free education, because if they really understood the struggle, and then even today, they would be supporting. Save
Right.
South Africa.
I'll have to stop you there because I want to give these panelists an opportunity to respond, but thank you. I'm going to start with you, but now we're going to go around the table. You have that question, Sipho, you can also pick up maybe in your response. And then I think whilst you're responding, maybe towards the end of your response, is there some final comments that you would like to make? And I did say in the briefing session to the 4 panelists, we are an educational institution, institution of higher learning, and it's important also to leave a message to our staff and our students what we should be doing or could be doing differently. So if you also could bring that into your response. Thank you.
So at a high level, and in the interest of time, there's a piece around racial tension, but also the government sovereignty. So I think we will do well as business if we realize what our role is in the broader scheme of things. Number one, of course, is to ensure that we are a trusted advisor. 2, we are a partner of choice. And then lastly, is to ensure that we make this government a capable state. Business must make government a capable state because you need both. On the strategy that we've adopted as business in ousting the former president, Jacob Zuma, because he was a thief, we were very explicit that 1, we stand for an inclusive socio-economic growth and transformation. Number 2, we said it's about protecting key state institutions. The last one was positioning business as a national asset. Now you take those 3 plus 3 and you counterweight them against the 4 principles on which state capture works. You can see why actually it was going to be a formula that works. The economic power patterns have been set for generations to come. unless you and I do something interventionist. You just have to be born white, the chances are you are going to live in Bryanston. Born black in Alexander, the chances are you are condemned to live in an informal settlement. What are we doing about that fundamental human right, the freedom from hunger? Pete says it's unsustainable that 67% of the C-suite and positions of leadership are still occupied by white males. And if we want this to be sustainable in the short term, so that we build this notion of long-term resilience, business need to say, how do we get our legitimacy, our social license to operate? How do we restore our credibility, reputation, and integrity? And it can only do that by doing the right things and ensuring that it always has the moral high ground. My parting shot will be, instead of what can we say to our students, I think for me the greatest gift we can give these current leaders is to wipe off the entire historical student debt of 16.5 billion.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Bonang. Lindy?
I just want to say, I think your words are haunting me, and they are ringing in my ears. A culture of acceptance or silence because you're beaten down by the system. It's staying with me. And maybe one would say a culture of acceptance is maybe a position of luxury, because doing it for yourself is still being able to do so. That is so many problematics, and that brings me to the question of accountability. How do you do it? And this is another reality. How do you do anything in this country without money? I mean, a personal example, for example, I have a 6-year-old son. It's a lot of money to raise a kid. And if your kid has extra needs, it's a lot. I chatted to friends of mine, their daughter is on the autism spectrum, and they keep saying, how do you do this without money? And then we think, okay, we are able to afford occupational therapy, whatever therapy, medication, doctors for our kids. What about all those other kids who don't have this? Our kids have a chance because we've got the resources to give it to them. And now, again, accountability. Our court system, our justice system, it's one of our last holdouts, but it's under pressure. And one shouldn't rest on the laurels there. It's under pressure. And how do you take any matter to court without resources? So beaten into silence because you don't have the resources, or holding accountable because you do have the resources to do so. And that is a function of civil society. That is an opportunity to pool resources. Yes, business has a role to play there as well. But that is at least mobilizing the resources that we do have at our disposal to force this accountability. And I think in terms of our values and our students, it's the words of my own professors when I was a first-year student, and I remember particularly in political science class, they would point at us and say to us, you are the watchdogs of society. And it's always stayed with me, and I hope that I've continued to do that. This is a university with many faculties, many functions. Some of you are there to enable growth. And I think this question of accountability, I mean, growth goes without saying. The policies that we have on the books, the laws we have on the books are supposed to stimulate growth in order to fund development. If we have implementation, we will have growth and we will have development. For that, we need the accountability. So it is all a cycle. The best we can do is say we need to pool resources in order to force this through so that we are not beaten into silence.
Thank you very much, Lindy. Sipho?
Well, in my younger years,
It was like yesterday.
It was yesterday. I go back to that because I recall that the theory of the revolution was the seizure of state power. And it was not just a political project, it was a means to an end. And it emphasized the importance of state power, because the intention was that the state would then be used to mediate the reversal of discrimination and the impact of discrimination, etc., and abuses that black people suffered under colonialism and apartheid, etc. And I raise this to suggest that even the framing of the Constitution envisages a particular role for the state. Yes, I agree, we should think about what about citizens? What about labor? What about business? What about? All of us have a responsibility to ensure that we make a success of the system. And we must reflect on our failings. But you see, at the center is the state. The state must deliver the liberation of the people by introducing certain policies and execute those policies effectively. That's the duty of the state. Criminal justice system that fails, people can fight back and do all kinds of things, but essentially, to the extent that the state doesn't function, there will be rampant crime and there will be absence of safety for ordinary citizens. We must confront that. So, I invite you to take a moment to reflect that the Constitution was framed. I recall in 1982, the first time I met ANC President Oliver Tambo. He said, South Africa will be free. Our efforts should not just be focused on freeing it, but think about what kind of society we want to build thereafter. Uppermost in his mind was a concern about how much liberators became repressive dictators and oppressors after liberation. And that's why we have a constitutional democracy instead of a parliamentary sovereign system, which is about majoritarianism. Large numbers vote and support even that which is wrong. I'm a free citizen today. In the first instance, I owe my allegiance to the Constitution of this country. President that I supported when I voted, or the party that I supported when I voted at the election that betrays the Constitution, I feel free to challenge it and speak out and condemn it. Because my allegiance is to the Constitution. It is our social contract. It is a promise to the people. One of the biggest things that we must discover, particularly activists, that we must discover, is that the freedom of this nation rests with the Constitution and not with the individual persona and not with certain political parties. Because you see, when a business is corrupt, you can target that business, condemn it, and act against it. But when a state is corrupt, corruption is enabled in the entirety of society. We are condemned to corruption. So it is important for us to keep going back, without being defensive, to keep going back to reflect on whether the state is delivering that which the Constitution promises to South Africans. Fees must fall was a cry about a state that failed to truly open the doors of learning to all those who seek to be educated. You can say that about health, public health. You can say that about housing. You can say that about clean water. You can say that about a whole range of things. These are in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Unlike most countries, that Bill of Rights is justiciable. It is not what you do at your fancy, but it is a mandate to government. So, I can say Bonang, as the president of Business Unity South Africa, representing 98% of business in this country, business is failing. I can list a litany of reasons why business is failing to play its part. At the end of the day, to enforce business compliance and ensuring that business plays ball rests with the state. That's why the theory of the revolution was the seizure of state power, so that the state delivers that which meaningfully liberates the people of this country. It's a cop-out to constantly want to look at how we can find a way to be apologetic about the failings of some of our leaders and political parties. We owe our allegiance to the Constitution, not to a party and not to personas. Thanks.
Thanks, Ipo. Pete?
I was 3 or 4 years ago. I went to Moscow, to Russia. The Kremlin paid for it, by the way, fully, everything. And I've spoken to many Russians there at the university and in the streets and wherever I went. And the single narrative, the prevailing narrative was that the reason why we prefer Putin to be the president of this country is because we cannot be trusted with democracy. It's an incredible admission and confession that so many Russians make, that the reason why we vote for authoritarian character is because we cannot be trusted with democracy. In South Africa, to some extent, we have the same disease, that we don't trust democracy enough. But I just want to, the idea about a constitution is a master document arranging the architecture of the state, plotting the role of the individual and collective groups within that, but it does nothing for disempowered people. It doesn't give you a job, it doesn't give you the ability to take your children to school, it doesn't provide, it gives you nothing. That responsibility is with the politicians that you elect. But the Constitution is a meaningless document. It's something that the elites swing around like a big flag. Look, 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 this is what we're striving for, this is who we are. Unless you're empowered to access those assumed promises of a constitution, it is a meaningless document to you. So many South Africans, the poor, the destitute, the unemployed, will tell you, what has the constitution done for me? And if he says nothing, I agree with him or her. It has done nothing for them. So what we have to do is, and I don't want to go around bashing political parties. I don't think it's possible to reform the ANC or to fix it. We have to replace it. The way we have to replace it with a credible alternative that recognizes the value and the fact that the poor people, the destitute, those who are alienated, are our allies in this effort. We have to do it for them. And that's why, and without making propaganda for Arise Mzansi, I think that's the type of thing, the mindset that I think we need. And recently I saw Sungezu said on television that you cannot tell black South Africans that they are wrong to vote for the ANC. You must tell them that the liberation movement is their identity. It's an incredibly important part of their identity. That they deserve better. That it is possible to find another narrative, an idea that will provide for them as well, that will address the alienation, the poverty, the fact that they don't have access to those things that are promised in the Constitution. I like that mindset to say that we cannot seek to ignore the history of the liberation of the majority of South Africans when we start looking for an alternative. And we have to remember the unemployed, the poor, the destitute, the alienated, They are our allies in this pursuit of an alternative to what we have today. So if I have a message to my students, I always say to them, just remember that the people, we are the privileged. People sitting at the privileged. My students, they object a little bit when I tell them they are privileged. But we are the privileged. But our real allies in the pursuit of an alternative and the pursuit of a condition where the Constitution is meaningful for each and everybody lies in the fact that we have to remember that the poor, the destitute, the alienated people of this country, they are our allies in this process.
Thank you very much, Pete. I don't know what happened with our other panelist, but he probably will be back soon. It's actually very hard to summarize this debate, but I think putting it back to the theme of our thought leadership panel, which was about a culture of acceptance. And I think what it clearly is maybe there is a culture of acceptance. There are not full consensus around that, but there were clearly indications that there are. But maybe it's also that people have become exhausted to always raise these issues, talk to these issues, try to hold government accountable. So that for me is one of the things that came out. The important one is, so if there is a culture of acceptance, whether it's through exhaustion or fatigue, or whether it's there, how do you profile it more? How do you make it real in our interventions at a business level, at a civil society level, at an ordinary citizen level, and keeping in mind that I think the one thing that we all probably are at the same page, surely the panel, is that we have got a state that is failing, or a state that is absent, however you define that. And therefore, our voices will have to be constant. And we need to be much more, and I think the panel also indicated there that although these voices comes from the different sections, they're often very much focused in a narrow pocket approach. So there is fragmentation, which we should try to see how we could fill those gaps, those discrete gaps in between. Although the discussion wasn't about Rise and Manzi or the other alternatives for next year, Pete, I think the important thing is also to say that we, as ordinary citizens that do have the vote, have got an opportunity next year to exercise that vote, keeping in mind what came out of this specific discussion. And I want to finish off probably with the comments that Lindy made about the UDF. And the UDF, I think, is 40 years old this year. I think there's a whole series of celebrations happening. But the questions that the UDF people that started the UDF is exactly the questions that you ask. And perhaps maybe we should have that conversations again, and to say, well, how do you not only make your voice heard, but how do you challenge and come up with proposals in terms of structural reforming? Because if you don't do that, it will be, again, just try to make interventions at a very local level, and we need to see how we can raise that. In terms of the university, I often say to my staff and my students that although the university represents the cosmos of society, the real role of the university is actually to indicate how society should function, how society should look like. That's the reason why students come here. That's the transformational thinking that needs to happen. If we can't do that, we fail as an institution. And I think a lot of the value that came out of this panel and through the question should be food for thought for both our staff and our students to keep on saying that we are transforming individuals, thinking, generating new knowledge that hopefully would provide a society that is completely value-driven, a society that that Oliver Tambo, according to SIPO, was articulating what society should look like. And I think all of our efforts that we are doing should focus on that, and should also focus on what is the sort of leaders that we would like to see functioning in that society, leading a value-based society to the benefit of individuals, but ultimately also to the benefit of the country. To my panel, Bonang Moale, Lindy Koop, in the absence of Sipho Pitiana, Piet Krokamp, thank you very much for your contribution. And I think as an audience, thank you very much for your contributions, for being here, our virtual viewers, both through our website and our UFS YouTube channel. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I think the audience here can give our panelists a hand of applause. Thank you very much. There is some coffee outside and also something to eat as well. But thank you very much again. Thank you.